This week, when he flinched at my touch again, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I just sat there, watching a man I used to know retreat into silence. It wasn't sudden, it had been happening for months, slowly, like watching light fade from a room you once called home. The warmth was gone, the laughter was gone, and so was he. But I stayed, hoping he'd turn around. That night, I realized maybe love wasn't supposed to hurt this quietly. In the beginning, everything between us felt effortless, like breathing. We used to laugh over burnt toast on Sunday mornings, our coffee going cold as we talked about everything and nothing. He'd brush a strand of hair from my face while I rambled about some random story from work, and his eyes would soften in that way that made me feel like I was the only person in the world. Even our silences used to feel warm. I could sit beside him, both of us lost in our own thoughts, and somehow it still felt like we were together. But slowly, so slowly that I almost didn't notice, something began to change. It started with the small things. His replies became shorter, the pauses between them longer. I'd send a message just to say I missed him, and hours later he'd respond with a half-hearted same. The kind of word that says nothing and everything at once. At first, I told myself he was tired, that work was taking more from him than usual. He'd been coming home later, his eyes heavy, his voice quieter. I didn't want to make things harder, so I told myself not to overthink it. At breakfast, I noticed he stopped sitting across from me. He'd grab his coffee, scroll through his phone, and lean against the counter instead. I'd ask small questions, about his meeting, about dinner plans, and he'd answer without looking up, fingers tapping the screen as if I were background noise. There were no fights, no angry words, just a slow erasure of warmth. That's what made it confusing. How do you fight for something that's disappearing quietly, without a single blow? At night, I'd slide into bed beside him, hoping he'd reach for me the way he used to. But he'd turn away before I even touched him, pulling the blanket tight around his shoulders. The first few times, I told myself he was just exhausted. I'd whisper, "Good night," and wait for him to mumble it back. Sometimes he did, sometimes he didn't. Each silence felt like a tiny crack forming beneath everything we'd built. Still, I believed it was temporary. Relationships go through phases, right? Everyone says that. People get busy, distracted, lost in their own thoughts. It doesn't mean they stop loving you. That's what I told myself every time the distance grew a little wider. I blamed deadlines, stress, maybe even myself. Maybe I wasn't giving him enough space. Maybe I was expecting too much. So I kept pretending everything was fine. I smiled when he came home, cooked his favorite meals, laughed at jokes that weren't funny. I thought if I just kept the rhythm of us alive, he'd eventually fall back into step. But deep down, beneath all the excuses, something in me knew, the warmth I was waiting for wasn't coming back. Not this time. Days turned into weeks, and what used to feel like distance began to harden into routine. The rejection wasn't sudden anymore, it had rhythm, predictability. Every morning, I tried to bridge the space between us with small gestures, the kind that once meant everything. A light touch on his shoulder as I passed by, a hug from behind while he poured his coffee, a soft "I missed you" before he left for work. But his responses were always the same, barely their smiles, one-word answers, shoulders that stiffened beneath my hands. The silence between us had become its own kind of conversation, and I was the only one still trying to speak. Maybe tomorrow he'll hold me again, I'd whisper to myself at night, like a prayer I no longer believed in. But tomorrow always came the same way, quiet, distant, heavy. The bed felt larger now, the air colder. I'd wake up before him just to watch his face, searching for something familiar, some sign that the man I loved was still there beneath the weariness. But he'd roll over before I could find it, his back turned like a wall I couldn't climb. Evenings weren't any kinder. I'd set the table for two, light a candle the way he used to like, hoping it would remind him of our old dinners where laughter spilled louder than the TV. But now, he'd take his plate to the living room, eat half in silence, and disappear into his phone. I started memorizing the top of his head instead of his face, watching the blue light of his screen reflect in his eyes instead of the spark that used to live there. I tried to talk. God, I tried. About small things at first, how my day went, something funny I saw online, a movie we could watch together. But every time I opened up, he'd nod without looking, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. Sometimes he'd respond with a distracted "that's nice," and I'd force a smile to hide how much that small indifference hurt. Other times, he wouldn't answer at all. I started keeping my stories to myself. You can only talk to a closed door for so long before you stop knocking. I found myself replaying old memories like reruns of a show I couldn't let go of. I remembered how he used to hold my hand while driving, thumb brushing circles over my skin, like it was his way of saying "I'm here." I remembered the nights we'd stay up too late, whispering secrets under the blankets, our laughter soft and easy. I remembered the first time he told me he loved me, his voice shaking, his hands warm around mine. Now, when I reached for his hand, it stayed limp in mine, or worse, pulled away altogether. The contrast was unbearable. The warmth that once grounded me had turned to ice. I kept thinking maybe it was a phase, maybe everyone goes through this, maybe love just changes shape. But deep down, I knew what I was feeling wasn't love evolving, it was love fading. And still, I stayed. I held on to the echo of what we used to be, convincing myself that if I loved him hard enough, long enough, patiently enough, he'd remember how to love me too. But every day, it became clearer, I was the only one still reaching across a gap that was never going to close. There came a point when the silence between us started to sound like my own fault. I began to wonder if maybe I wasn't enough anymore. Maybe I'd changed in ways I couldn't see. Maybe the problem wasn't him, it was me. Those thoughts sank deep, filling the spaces where his affection used to live. I stopped blaming the long work hours or his exhaustion and started picking apart pieces of myself, searching for the flaw that made him stop reaching back. In the mornings, I'd stand in front of the mirror, trying to recognize the woman staring back. Her eyes looked tired, softer somehow, dulled by too many nights spent waiting for something that never came. I'd fix my hair differently, try on new clothes, swipe on lipstick shades I hadn't worn in years. Maybe if I looked the way I used to when he first fell in love with me, he'd notice again. But when he walked past me that evening, he didn't even look up. I smiled anyway, pretending it didn't sting. I started overcompensating in small ways, cooking his favorite meals even when I wasn't hungry, leaving little notes by his coffee, planning quiet movie nights or date ideas he used to love. But every gesture fell into emptiness. He'd nod politely, say thanks, and return to his scrolling. The dinner table became a place where I performed love, while he sat across from me, unaware that I was falling apart in silence. Sometimes, I'd sit in the bathroom late at night, letting the faucet run just to cover the sound of my breathing. I didn't want to cry loudly. I didn't want to seem desperate. I'd tell myself, he's just going through something. You just need to be patient. That was the lie I used to keep from breaking. But the truth was simpler and sharper, I was the only one trying. Still, I couldn't bring myself to confront him. Every time I rehearsed the words, "Are we okay, or do you still love me?" they caught in my throat. I was terrified of his answer, or worse, his silence. Because silence had already told me everything I didn't want to hear. So I kept fixing, adjusting, pretending. I became a version of myself built around his absence, smiling when I wanted to scream, holding him in my mind because he wouldn't let me hold him in reality. And somewhere in that quiet desperation, I stopped recognizing which hurt more, the distance between us, or the way I'd started to disappear inside it. It happened one night, in the quiet space between dinner and bed, the time that used to belong to us. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone again, the blue light painting his face in a shade that felt colder than ever. I'd been carrying the weight of unspoken words for weeks, and that night, I couldn't hold them in anymore. My voice came out softer than I expected, barely a whisper. "Can we talk?" He didn't look up right away. Just a small sigh, a nod that felt more like a habit than agreement. I sat down beside him, hands trembling, rehearsing the words I'd repeated in my head 100 times. "I just feel like you've been distant lately. Like you're here, but you're not really here." He finally glanced at me, eyes tired, expression unreadable. "I'm just tired," he said. The words felt like a wall. I nodded slowly, trying to find a crack in it. "I know you've been busy, but it feels different. We barely talk anymore. You don't even look at me the same way." He rubbed the back of his neck, still avoiding my eyes. "It's not you. It's just me. I've got a lot on my mind." Those 7 words, "it's not you, it's just me," were supposed to comfort, but instead, they hollowed me out. I'd heard them before, from other people and other stories, but never thought they'd sound this final coming from him. I wanted to ask what he meant, to dig deeper, but his tone told me not to. He was already miles away. I reached out, gently placing my hand on his. It was instinct, the last piece of me still trying to bridge the distance. For a second, I thought he might hold on. But then, he pulled away, quick, almost reflexive, like my touch burned. The space between us felt colder than the air around us. I didn't cry. Not this time. The pain was too deep for tears, too settled. I just sat there, staring at the spot where our hands had almost met, realizing that the ache in my chest wasn't from losing him, it was from finally accepting that he was already gone. He mumbled something about needing to sleep and walked past me without looking back. I listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway, then the quiet click of the bedroom door. The house felt enormous, echoing with everything we no longer said. I stayed on the couch for a long time, staring into nothing, replaying every moment that had led to this one. Every ignored touch, every forced smile, every maybe tomorrow. It all led here, to this silence, this stillness that didn't feel like peace but like the aftermath of something that used to be alive. And in that quiet, something inside me finally broke, not loudly, not dramatically, but softly, like the end of a song no one noticed had stopped playing. That was the moment I understood, maybe love doesn't live here anymore. After that night, something in me just stopped. I didn't make a conscious choice to give up. It was more like my heart quietly shut a door I didn't realize was still open. The next morning, I didn't reach for him when he brushed past me in the kitchen. I didn't ask how he slept or if he wanted coffee. I just watched him move through the space we once shared like a stranger borrowing time. I stopped trying to fix us. No more forced conversations, no more goodnight whispers hoping he'd answer. I let the silence stretch, and for the first time, I didn't rush to fill it. It was strange, peaceful in a painful sort of way. Like I'd been holding my breath for months, and now that I'd finally exhaled, there was nothing left to fight for. The house began to sound different too. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, even the wind brushing against the windows, they were louder now, sharper somehow. Maybe they'd always been this way, and I was just too distracted by love to notice. The spaces that once felt warm and alive now echoed with emptiness. The couch where we used to watch movies together felt too big. The kitchen table, too quiet. I'd walk past our photos on the wall, smiles frozen in time, and wonder who those people even were. I didn't stop caring overnight, but the pain dulled into something heavier, numbness. It was a strange kind of freedom, not having to hope anymore. I didn't look for signs of affection or wait for him to change. I just observed. He noticed, of course. How could he not? The way I stopped asking about his day, stopped setting the table for two, stopped trying to catch his gaze when he walked into the room. He saw it, but he didn't say a word. And that silence, that lack of reaction, confirmed what I already knew. You don't ignore something you want to save. So instead of talking to him, I started writing. Late at night, when the house was still and he was asleep, I'd pull out an old notebook and pour everything onto paper, the confusion, the grief, the quiet surrender. I didn't write to heal or to understand. I wrote so I wouldn't disappear completely into the silence. Each page became a small rebellion, proof that I was still here, even if he no longer saw me. The house began to mirror my insides, still, tidy, but lifeless. The scent of his cologne faded from the hallway. The laughter that once filled the kitchen had long vanished. What remained was an echo of what love used to sound like, a haunting reminder that even beautiful things can rot when neglected. I used to think heartbreak was loud, full of shouting and tears. But the truth is, it's quiet. It happens in the spaces between words, in the moments when you stop trying and start seeing things exactly as they are. And in that stillness, I realized, the home I was trying to protect had already crumbled. I was just the last one standing inside the ruins. The truth didn't arrive all at once, it crept in, the same way the distance had. Little details I'd brushed off before started making sense in ways I wished they didn't. His phone, for example. How he started keeping it face down, even when we were alone. How messages that once stayed unread for days now suddenly required his full attention, even in the middle of dinner. I'd catch the faint buzz of notifications at night, the soft glow of the screen lighting up his face as he turned slightly away from me. I used to pretend I didn't see it. Pretending was easier than knowing. Then there was the scent. Faint, but unfamiliar, a soft, floral perfume that wasn't mine. I noticed it on his jacket once, and again on the collar of his shirt. The first time, I told myself maybe someone at work had hugged him, maybe it was nothing. But maybe started sounding like a word people use when they're afraid to face the truth. I stopped asking questions, not because I didn't care, but because I already knew the answers would hurt more than silence ever could. There was a time when I would have been furious, demanding explanations, begging for honesty. But by then, the anger just never came. What replaced it was something quieter, acceptance, maybe even relief. I was done fighting for clarity from someone who had no interest in giving it. His emotional absence had already hollowed me out long before any other betrayal could. I began to see it for what it was, not just neglect, but a form of cruelty. The kind that doesn't bruise the skin but bruises the soul. Emotional abuse doesn't always come in shouting or slammed doors, sometimes it comes in withheld affection, in blank stares, in the quiet decision to let someone starve for love while sitting right beside them. That realization hit me harder than any confession ever could. So I stopped trying to make sense of it. I stopped wondering what I'd done wrong or who else might have filled the spaces I couldn't. I'd spent too long believing my worth depended on how much he saw me, how much he cared. But standing there in the quiet, I realized something freeing. His blindness didn't make me invisible. His inability to love me didn't make me unlovable. The silence that once felt suffocating started to feel like space I could finally breathe in. I didn't need him to validate my existence anymore. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't searching for his gaze or his approval. I was just being. And that was enough. The day I finally left him wasn't marked by shouting or slammed doors, it was quiet, almost gentle. There was no announcement, no goodbye speech, no dramatic moment. I simply woke up one morning and realized that my heart had already gone. The version of me that begged for scraps of affection was gone too. I didn't cry. I just sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the sunlight spilling across the floor, and felt something I hadn't felt in months, peace. I went about my day differently. I didn't wait for him to text or glance up from his phone. I stopped checking the clock to see when he'd come home. Instead, I opened a book I'd been meaning to read for months, one that had sat untouched on my nightstand. I poured myself tea, curled up by the window, and read until the words began to drown out the noise in my head. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. At night, I started sleeping on my side of the bed, just mine. No more pretending to share space with someone who had already left emotionally. I slept soundly, deeply, without the anxious stirring that used to come from listening for the sound of his voice or the shift of his weight beside me. The silence that once ached now soothed. It wasn't loneliness anymore, it was solitude, and there's a difference. One afternoon, while tidying up, I found our photo albums on the shelf. I opened one and saw our smiles, frozen, perfect, from a time when I still believed love could survive anything. My fingers hesitated, then moved with quiet certainty. One by one, I began removing the photos from their frames. Not out of anger, but out of acceptance. Each picture went into a box, folded neatly, not thrown away. I wasn't erasing the past, I was simply choosing not to live inside it anymore. As I placed the last frame face down, a strange calm settled over me. I finally understood something I'd been resisting for so long. Sometimes walking away isn't failure, it's survival. Loving someone shouldn't feel like drowning. Staying shouldn't require you to shrink yourself smaller and smaller until you disappear. I didn't need revenge, or closure, or even an apology. What I needed was myself, whole, unbroken, free from waiting for someone who had already stopped showing up. Letting go didn't mean I stopped loving him, it just meant I chose to love myself more. And as the evening light filled the empty spaces around me, I realized that the silence wasn't the end of something, it was the beginning of me. I didn't leave with anger or tears. I left with silence, the same silence he gave me. For so long, I begged for eye contact, for warmth, for something to tell me we could still be us. But the truth was simple, I was holding on to a ghost. The day I stopped reaching for him, I finally found myself again. Maybe he'll notice the absence one day. But by then, I'll be too far gone, healing somewhere he can't reach.